I work for my country's customs administration, as does my upstairs neighbor. It is a house with 2 apartments in it, whom I will call Mark. Mark is over a decade younger than me and moved in right after graduating from our training program. We don't work at the same post, so we don't really hang out much except when we are both at home. And while I am somewhat of a loner, I did develop a somewhat close semi-professional relationship with him. We take care of the house together, and I have on more than one occasion given him advice regarding various issues we encountered during work. In doing so, I also became privy to his personal life. To sum it up, Mark didn't have it easy. His mother passed away when he was young and his father quickly remarried. His new wife had a son as well. I will call him Steve, who was the same age as Mark, and it became very apparent very quickly that Steve was the golden child who could do no wrong. Mark's father didn't pay much attention to this and even encouraged it. What inevitably followed was a long stretch of neglect. Mark slowly worked his way through school, getting mediocre grades and dealing with the fact that most if not all of the attention and resources that should go to both children were mainly aimed at his stepbrother. Over time, Mark's father seemed to warm up to the idea that the focus of attention should be Steve more and more. One should note that Steve's grades apparently weren't better than Mark's, but in his case a handy excuse was always ready. Mark never explicitly said it, but the way he told the story, I suspect there was some physical abuse directed at him as well, though I can't prove it and I never pressed the issue. To add insult to injury, Mark's father owned a company and was grooming his stepson Steve to take it over one day. As not to appear completely insensitive, he had made it clear that Mark would have a place in the company as a regular employee, as long as he didn't question Steve's authority. Mark saw his chance when he turned 19 and was drafted into the armed forces. My country still has compulsory military service for all able-bodied male citizens. He sold what he could beforehand, packed his belongings, and disappeared from his family home, essentially cutting all ties with them. His family, despite their treatment of him, took this as some sort of insult, resulting in a flurry of angry letters. Letters are delivered by military mail for free, riddled with insults and indirect threats. In the end, they seem to get tired of not getting a rise out of Mark, and the final letter, which Mark still hasn't showed me, simply stated that he was dead to them.
Mark disappeared into one of the many barracks in my nation and ended up serving in uniform for over 4 years. The lack of family support wasn't an issue, since the army pays for everything. Food, shelter, insurance, it was all taken care of. It was also there where he met his now fiancée, whom I will call Nadine. Women can serve voluntarily, and funnily enough, Nadine had used this option to escape similar circumstances as Mark. It was a match made in hell, which resulted in relationship heaven. I have rarely seen 2 people more devoted to each other, and it is honestly kind of cringe. After leaving the army, Mark had applied to the customs administration, was selected and completed training. After getting his job posting, he moved into the apartment above mine. And this is when the trouble started, and to be fair, it was Mark's own fault. He had excitedly posted about having his first own apartment excessively on social media, mistake, including the monthly rent, bigger mistake. The apartments we live in cost about 55% of what the market would normally demand and are thus ridiculously cheap. I will explain later. This led to his estranged family suddenly turning up. To cut it short, while Mark was serving in the army, Steve had successfully evaded serving, got married, had a kid, took over the company of his stepfather and bankrupted it. He had a regular job now, but it provided nowhere near the income he enjoyed while being his own boss and while his family's savings lasted. This meant having to live in a small apartment, which was, of course, unacceptable to him. What seemed to be even more unacceptable was Mark enjoying a much larger apartment for much lower rent. So Mark's family decided that they should ambush him and demand that he move out so Steve can move in. Especially his biological father had a stern talk with Mark, during which he educated him man to man about why he should take responsibility and let Steve have the apartment since Steve needed and deserved it more. After all, the failure of the company wasn't really Steve's fault, and unlike Mark, he already had a kid. Mark was outraged, but kept the stoic demeanor expected of a former Army Master Sergeant. His family wouldn't take no for an answer, and after 3 months of hounding him in person and online, he finally caved. Except he didn't. Mark had decided to teach them a lesson, and I was happy to sit by and watch.
What Mark's family didn't know was why the apartment was so cheap. Government officials in my country don't enjoy too many perks, but some do exist. Since customs officers had to live close by the border in ancient times, the Customs Administration has built a large number of houses exclusively for their employees as not to inconvenience them with long commutes. Mark and me lived in such a house. The apartments can naturally be rented by civilians as well. But, and I am sure you already guessed it, the rent automatically goes up to market prices in such a case. Mark's family had obviously overlooked that part of the rental agreement, and neither me nor Mark felt the need to tell them. Steve moved in, had a lavish welcome party, and lived happily until rent was due for the first time. What followed was disbelief, anger, whining, begging, arguing, and negotiating. Except none of that helps when dealing with the Customs Administration's Housing and Infrastructure Division. Steve wasn't a customs officer and thus not entitled to reduced rent. The contract was signed and he had to pay. Meanwhile, Mark and Nadine were nowhere to be found. Mark had learned his lesson, shut down all of his social media accounts, and left no trace as to where he resided now. Turning up at his post wasn't an option for Steve either, unless he wanted to face 30 of Mark's work colleagues, all armed to the teeth and in a perpetually bad mood. I didn't know where Mark was either, so talking to me was a waste of time as well. Steve moved out after only 6 weeks, aided by his stepfather, all of them with faces as if they smelled shit all the time. Mark moved back in with Nadine 2 weeks after that. The two are still cringe, but by the heavens that was some quality entertainment.